Hi, my name is Benjamin and this is another episode in my series of ReaLearn tutorial videos. Today we will have a closer look at the mapping panel. What I just did is adding a new instance of ReaLearn to an empty Reaper project. Currently we are looking at ReaLearn's main panel. The mapping panel is a window that opens when you added a single mapping. So first, let's add a single mapping. And then press Edit. For now, I will close the main panel so we have less distraction. Some of the elements on the mapping panel go very deep and certainly deserve their own episode. However, I will try to say at least a little bit about most of the elements here. Let's start with the mapping name field in the top left corner. There you can enter a descriptive name for the mapping. For example, cutoff. It will also be visible in the mapping row of the main panel. Next to the name field, we have the tags field. Tags are like keywords and they can be used to categorize your mapping. You can enter as many tags as you want, comma separated. ReaLearn has a few targets which allow you to address mappings by using tags. Let's enter two tags, guitar and keys. You need to press Tab or click in another text field to apply the tags. Tags are visible in the main panel as well, and you can even search for them by using a hashtag. I don't show that now. Then we have the checkboxes Control and Feedback, which you can use to disable control or feedback direction. You already know them from the main panel. Right below we have the button Find in Mapping List, which I already used a few times. Press it to make this mapping visible in the main panel. Our next element is the Active drop-down. With that you can define under which conditions your mapping becomes active. By default it's always active. This is a core feature of ReaLearn and it's called conditional activation, ReaLearn's unique take on banks, pages and modifiers. We will look into it in detail in one of the next episodes. The feedback dropdown lets you decide when to send feedback to your controller. Always use the normal setting, unless your controller is somewhat sensitive. In that case, look up the available options in the user guide. Show in projection decides whether this mapping shows up in ReaLearn's projection view, a feature that we will talk about in more detail another time. Same with advanced settings, which are a little bit out of scope today. Let's jump to the bottom for a moment. There we have the Beep on Success checkbox. It gives you a signal whenever the target is controlled successfully. Let's try it. At first, learn a source. I take this button on the APC key 25. Let's take the master volume as target. With the arrow buttons you can navigate in the mapping list. Let's try that. Add a second mapping temporarily. And now we can easily jump to the next or previous mapping. By the way, this also respects the filter settings and the search text in the main panel. Let's remove the second mapping for now. We don't need it anymore. The Enable checkbox enables or disables the complete mapping. You can also control that in the mapping panel. Now we move on to the big sections of the mapping panel: source, target and clue. As we learned already in previous tutorials, the source is in most cases some control element on your controller. For example, a key on a MIDI keyboard. The target most of the time represents something in Reaper. The control direction flows from the source to the target. The feedback direction flows back from the target to the source. But ReaLearn has also something else. It's called the clue section. It sits between the source and the target. With that, the signal flow for the control direction goes from the source to the clue and from the clue to the target. And the signal flow for the feedback direction goes from the target to the clue back to the source. Let's start with the source section. Most of the time, it's not necessary to click yourself through the many options of the source settings. Because we have a learn function, simply click learn and move or press something on your controller. Usually you don't have to do anything else, but of course there are exceptions. Some controllers have elements that you cannot move or press, such as LEDs that are not connected to a button or displays. Such elements work in the feedback direction only. You cannot use them to control anything. In this case, we need to select the source manually. Now let's fast forward to the target section. Some of the targets can be learned as well. But unlike sources, there are many targets that cannot be learned. You need to select them manually. ReaLearn provides a lot of targets and the list is growing. Many of those targets correspond to features of Reaper itself. But lately I have been adding more and more targets that are unique to ReaLearn. Today I will not talk about each source or target in particular. Instead, I want to move on to a topic that is important for all sources and all targets: the clue section. It's probably the section that needs the most explanation. And it's really worth to spend some time to understand it. Because once you understand it, you can combine it with any source and any target out there. It's one of the core reasons why ReaLearn is that powerful. As a preparation, I will choose the APC Key 25 MIDI keyboard as input and output. In addition, I will choose an easy-to-understand source, a knob on my MIDI keyboard, and an easy-to-understand target, the master volume. Starting from here, we will explore the different features of the clue section. Press the button Reset to Defaults to make sure that the settings of the clue sections are normal. We will go from the most important settings to the less important ones. I would say the most important one is the target minimum and maximum. With that you can restrict the controlled target value range. In one of the previous tutorials we have seen that this doesn't just affect the control direction, but also the feedback direction. That's true for quite a number of clue settings. The target range is not just interesting for faders, knobs or encoders, it's also interesting for buttons. So let's learn a button source, a key on your MIDI keyboard. That one is even velocity sensitive. You can see that the velocity of my button press makes a difference. Adjusting target min-max allows me to fine-tune the effect of different velocities. Another frequent use of target min-max is to define a particular target value. For this, simply set target min and target max to the same value, which you can then recall by pressing the button. No matter what I do, I will end up at 0 decibel. The second most important element is probably reverse. It allows you to reverse or inverse the incoming control value and outgoing feedback value. You see, it's moving in the opposite direction. The next interesting thing is Takeover mode. So far we have been using only absolute control elements. Knobs, buttons, faders. One inherent disadvantage of absolute control is that you can get parameter jumps. In other words, the position of your fader or knob on your controller can get out of sync with the position of the parameter in Reaper. Look, I move the knob and the master volume jumps. By its very nature, relative control doesn't have this issue. A typical way to get relative control is to use a rotary endless encoder, which usually transmits relative control messages. My MIDI keyboard doesn't have any, so I will switch over to the X-Touch 1 control surface. Its jog wheel is a rotary endless encoder. You can see counterclockwise movement moves a bit strangely. We will fix that later, don't worry about it now. As you can see, there's no jump when I move it. Now let's go back to absolute control and use the knob of the MIDI keyboard again. There is something we can do to avoid jumps, and this is setting a special takeover mode. The most simple one is pick up. It's the same as soft takeover in Reaper. In this mode, nothing will happen when I move the knob, until it finally meets the position of the parameter. Simply try the other modes to see what they can do. Catch up is a nice one, for example. Now let's get back to the defaults and talk about absolute modes. When an absolute control message, for example a fader or knob movement, comes in, ReaLearn usually just takes this value and applies it to the target. This is called normal mode. ReaLearn also has a couple of other modes which handle things differently. Let's look at some modes that can be applied to buttons. So at first I learn a button source, and right now, as you can see, it operates in normal mode. Track volume is not a very realistic target for a button, so let's choose track mute instead. The most important alternative mode is toggle button. With that, whenever you press a button, the target switches on or off, depending on its previous state. Make sure not to use the built-in toggle feature of your controller. The controller button itself should always be configured as gate or momentary, never as toggle button. This is the only way to give ReaLearn complete control over what happens when you press the button. Another wonderful mode is Incremental button. With that, you can increase or decrease the target value simply by pressing the button repeatedly. Enable reverse if you want to decrease the value. If you need both, just create two mappings. By the way, this mode is relative. That means you don't have to worry about parameter jumps. And here comes one of the coolest features of ReaLearn, control transformation formulas. I'm going to demonstrate it with a knob controlling master volume. The control transformation feature allows you to apply arbitrary transformation to the incoming control value. Press the button next to the text field to open the transformation editor. The easiest way to get started is to pick one of the existing templates. This one, for example, is an exponential curve. At the moment, you need to close the editor in order to apply the transformation. Something I want to improve soon. Now, as you can see, you have very fine-grained control in the lower values. And it gets faster and more coarse-grained as soon as you reach the higher ones. But this is just the beginning. ReaLearn also supports time-based transformations. For example, modulations and transitions. Here we have a typical sinus modulation. Modulations and transitions are typically triggered by buttons. So let's apply the template by closing the editor, learn a button, and trigger the modulation. This one stops as soon as you release the button. Transitions are basically modulations that have a well-defined end. Here we have a transition that gives you a linear fade in or fade out to the target value. I have been using this a lot in live situations. It's very practical. Simply enable reverse if you want it to be a fade out instead of a fade in. Or if you don't want to stop it when releasing the button, switch the button filter to press only. We will learn about that in a minute. You see, what makes ReaLearn so flexible is that you can combine different features to achieve your result. Next topic is fire modes. They allow you to distinguish between short press, long press, double press, single press, you will see. Usually, pressing the button immediately invokes the target. But we can tell ReaLearn to only react if I have pressed the button at least half a second. Then short presses don't have an effect anymore. But if I press it long enough, something will happen as soon as I release the button. If you want it to happen while still pressing the button, you need fire after timeout mode. We can also choose to react only if I press the button twice. You can use fire on single press in another mapping to trigger two different functions, depending on whether you press it twice or once. The last one, fire after timeout, keep firing, is great for incremental button mode. It allows you to continue triggering the target as long as you keep the button pressed. The timeout setting determines how long it waits before firing continuously. The rate defines how frequently it fires. A very simple setting is a button filter drop-down. We can use it to react to the button press only, ignoring the release, or vice versa. Quite useful. The next interesting setting is not visible at the moment, because it can only be applied to relative control elements. My MIDI keyboard doesn't have any relative control elements, so I choose the X-Touch 1 control surface instead. It features a big jog wheel, which is essentially a rotary endless encoder. When learning the source, ReaLearn detected the encoder type incorrectly, so I need to set it manually. It's relative type 3. That works better. Now we can see the step min-max setting. It lets you choose the step size of a single encoder turn. You can manually enter step sizes below 1%. The most significant setting is the step size minimum. Step size maximum allows you to limit the effect of encoder acceleration, if it's supported by your hardware. We have seen this in a previous tutorial. Relative control also allows you to wrap or rotate around the target boundaries. As soon as it reaches the maximum value, it continues at the minimum. You can also choose to pick up movements in one direction only. For example, increment only ignores counterclockwise movements. This can be interesting to trigger two different actions depending on the direction of movement. For this, you would need two mappings mapped to the same encoder. Let's move on to the next checkbox, Make Absolute. Usually, if you have a rotary endless encoder, you want relative control. Relative control is great and provides more flexibility than absolute control. However, some features cannot be used with relative control, most notably control transformation. In this case, tick the Make Absolute checkbox. This gives you back the possibility to apply control transformations. You can even combine that with the usual relative settings such as step size. However, remember, now you have absolute control. That means you might run into parameter jumps. There's something similar to control transformation, but for the feedback direction. We call it feedback transformation. To be honest, personally, I rarely use that, but maybe you find some usage for that. The idea is to transform outgoing feedback values before they reach the source. Let's try that with a motor fader as source. I will enter a simple formula which leads to the same effect as a reverse checkbox. And as you can see, the motor fader now moves in the opposite direction. Speaking of feedback, ReaLearn doesn't just support numeric feedback, but also text feedback. Text feedback makes sense for MIDI hardware displays, but also for OSC apps or the text-to-speech source. Let's try it with a MIDI hardware display built into the XTouch One. This one follows the Mackie protocol, so we choose Mackie LCD. Now you can see the track volume presented on your display, including the unit decibel. ReaLearn automatically chooses some text that makes sense for the selected target. But you can also define the text yourself, simply by entering it into the text expression field. You can use placeholder to include information dynamically. All available placeholders are mentioned in the user guide. For this demonstration, I will use the track name placeholder. It outputs the name of the track which is associated with the target of this mapping. I will quickly adjust the target so it always reflects the currently selected track. Have a look at the display. The track name changes whenever we select a new track. Actually, we don't strictly need a track volume target for that. The track volume doesn't play any role anymore in this mapping. It's cleaner to just use the track target. It's perfect for displaying some track-related information. If the text field is not big enough for your text, you can press the button next to it and choose Edit Multiline. This opens a simple editor which also contains a useful help button. The button next to the text field also gives you access to color feedback. Of course, this only works if the controller supports it. In case of the XTouch, you have to use XTouch Mackie LCD to make it work. The XTouch One controller, which I have, unfortunately doesn't support colors in Mackie mode. The next setting of interest is source min max. It's best demonstrated using some fader. Now we are ready to demonstrate source min max. It's something I don't use that often personally, but at times it can be quite useful. Let's say I just want to use the upper portion of my fader, to control the complete target range. I can do this by setting the source minimum to about 50%. Or I could choose to just use the lower portion of the fader. The setting right below, out of range behavior, is directly connected to it. It decides about what ReaLearn does if it receives a message from the unused portion of the fader. By default, it just behaves as if you hit the fader boundary. But there are other options as well. The out-of-range behavior minimum can sometimes be useful for LED feedback, but this is a topic for another time. In the context of fader control, ignore is another very useful out-of-range behavior. It just ignores out-of-range fader movements. This can be useful for touch strips to assign different portions of the strip to different targets. A pretty cool setting which I completely forgot talking about is the target value sequence. You can use that to step through certain values of the target, not all of them. You just need to enter the values, in this case decibel, comma separated, and press Tab. Now swiping the fader will step between 4 distinct values. You can even enter ranges in the value sequence field, but I won't show that now. Value sequences are also compatible with relative control, because now we have 4 distinct values instead of a continuous value range. We don't see a step size setting, but a speed setting. The speed setting simply decides how many steps to walk with one single encoder turn. By default, it's exactly 1 step. You can also take many steps at once, skipping intermediate values. If your target has a lot of distinct values, this makes your encoder feel more sensitive. What about the opposite, making your encoder feel less sensitive? You can achieve that by using negative speed values. In this example, only every 5th encoder turn will have an effect. In other words, you need to turn your encoder a bit more. Last topic for today, group interaction. Usually, if you want to control multiple targets with one control element, you would just add multiple mappings with the same source. That's easy enough, but there's an alternative and it's called group interaction. It provides interesting possibilities to interact with mappings in the same group. So at first, let's add another mapping to the group. That was a wrong button. Here we are. I'm adding a new mapping to the default group. The source doesn't matter because we want to control this mapping via group interaction, not directly. As target, I learned the volume fader of track 1. Now I set group interaction to same control. This has almost the same effect as assigning the same source to the other mappings. As you can see, the targets themselves are not connected to each other. They are still independent. All clue settings are also independent of each other. There are other, more interesting group interaction modes, for example, inverse target value or same target value. Even it might seem that way, it doesn't connect the targets directly to each other. But whenever you control the lead mapping, it will give the other mappings in the group the same or inverse target value. That's a bit like the track grouping lead-follow mechanics in Reaper itself. Interesting to know, even with group interaction same target value, it will respect the target min max values of the other mappings in the group. As a side note, group interaction is also useful with buttons, especially when using the interaction mode same target value on only. This basically gives you a very flexible opportunity to switch the target value of this mapping on and of all other mappings in the same group off, or vice versa. That's it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Next time I will probably show you conditional activation. It's such a big feature in ReaLearn, and once you master it, the sky is the limit.